When a lion is part of a freak accident, a man saves him on a cliff. What happens next is not for the faint of heart. There was a gap, just small enough for Thomas to try and get some air. He tried to steady his breathing. He knew that panicking wouldn't help anything, but the fact had crossed his mind that everyone in the nearby area would be busy trying to deal with the mudslide. They wouldn't be looking for him, and if he didn't get help soon, things could end badly for him. He was trapped, barely able to move as the thick mud engulfed him. But then, through the gap, a shadow passed by. A few seconds of silence followed before Thomas felt a heavy sensation through the mud and movement that made him hope he was being freed. He closed his eyes as he thought about his life and prayed this wasn't the end. The National Park Ranger had spent his life helping people and animals, and now he was the one in need of help. For some reason, one particular rescue came to mind, and he allowed himself to be distracted by the memory of the lion he saved on a cliff. He thought he saw sandy-colored fur through the gap, but he didn't know if it was his mind playing tricks. Either way, it had brought the memory to his mind, a welcome distraction from his terrifying situation. Thomas had always been the kind of person who would help anyone or anything. Becoming a national park ranger had been his dream since he was a child, so the day he got the job was one of the happiest of his life. Soon, the young man found himself not only a fierce protector of the animals and environment he worked in, but also a loyal friend to the people he worked with. The national park was his life, and he'd find himself staying there long after his shift had ended, either wrapping up bits of work or lending an ear and giving advice to his friends. Everyone always remarked on how he was one of the kindest people they'd ever met. It warmed the young man's heart to know he was doing good in the world. The animals in the national park had protection and safety, but they were still allowed to live as they would in the wild. That meant that sometimes it was hard for Thomas to sit back and let nature take its course. He understood the importance of not intervening in most situations, but sometimes he wished he could. The animals couldn't become dependent on humans, though. If their populations were to increase in the wild, they had to live a natural life. The park simply provided safety from poachers and hunters. If someone was to ask him, he'd be hard-pressed to say what his favorite part of the job was because he truly loved it all. But one thing that always struck him as special was watching the lions. They were the only Asiatic lions left in the wild, and it was an honor to be able to see them up close so regularly. In the early mornings, you could catch them roaring and being more active before it got too hot, and as the sun set, he could spend forever watching them lay around in the last of the sunshine. Early one morning, Thomas headed out in his Jeep to do a sweep of the park, checking that everything was as it should be. The national park was so vast that the rangers usually got assigned a specific area to check. Today, much to his delight, Thomas was around the cliffs where one of the largest lion prides lived. They loved the mix of rocks and ledges where they could jump around or lie down. Even though he'd been doing this job for a while now, there was always something breathtaking about seeing a lion at the top of the cliff surveying its land. But it was dangerous territory too, and the cliffs could be unforgiving for adolescent lions not experienced enough to know the dangers. He'd never witnessed it himself, but he'd heard stories from some of the older rangers of lions getting into trouble on the cliffs. He knew the extremely dry weather they had been having didn't help either. In the intense heat, the floor would often crack and pieces of the cliff could easily crumble away. Thomas checked his watch. He had a few minutes to spare. He was happy because that meant he could pack up and watch the lions for a little longer before moving on to his next job. The sun was just starting to peek over the cliffs, and he noticed a few lions just waking up near the top. This particular pride had a few adolescents, and Thomas was happy to see they weren't up on the cliffs alone. He smiled as he watched them stretch out and start to roam around. At that moment, there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be. But suddenly, he noticed something that turned his joyous, peaceful moment into a terrifying experience. A few of the younger lions were playing close to the edge, and Thomas could see some of the rock crumbling and tumbling to the ground. The weather had been extremely dry recently, and he couldn't remember the last time they had rain. He watched as piles of rubble and dust broke from the cliff edge and cascaded to the ground, and he prayed that the pride would notice what was happening and call the lions back. Thomas breathed a sigh of relief when one of the older lions stood up and began to call to the playful teens. His relief was brief, though, as everything was about to go wrong. The adolescent lions were clearly testing their boundaries and ignored the calls of the older lion, not realizing the danger they were in. The older lion was determined not to be ignored, though, and stepped forward, roaring. The younger lions immediately stopped what they were doing and retreated, their game cut short. All the movement had further disturbed the already crumbling cliff edge, though, and Thomas watched in horror as the lion slipped over the edge, a cloud of dust surrounding him. The lion was just about managing to hold on, but if something wasn't done soon to help him, he'd be following the pile of rocks that were currently plummeting to the ground. Thomas grabbed his radio and immediately called for help, explaining the situation. This simply wasn't one of the times where he could let nature run its course. He had to save the lion. He started up the jeep and drove closer to the cliff. He needed to be extremely careful, but he also needed to drive the pride away to rescue the lion without putting himself in danger. Beeping his horn and revving the engine, he hoped his tactics would have the desired effects without him getting too close to the cliff. Thankfully, the pride was relatively small, and as soon as one lion moved away, the rest followed. With the area cleared, it was time to get to work. Thomas knew that backup was on the way, but he couldn't afford to lose a single second. Grabbing ropes from his jeep, he jumped out and tentatively stepped towards the cliff. He could see the lion thrashing around and struggling in an attempt to pull himself up. He began to uncoil the ropes, knowing they were the only way he'd be able to pull the lion up to safety. Just as he finished untangling everything, he heard the welcome sounds of the other jeeps behind him as more rangers ran up to help. Tying the ropes around the lion, they all pulled collectively to hoist the lion up. It wasn't an easy task, given the lion's weight and the unstable nature of the cliff. The lion was now only secured by their ropes, having let go of the cliff edge. It was just dangling in midair. They had to muster all of their strength to save the poor animal. Thomas took the lead and rallied everyone, counting to 3. They all pulled as hard as they could. Much to the young ranger's delight, their efforts finally paid off, and the lion emerged back over the cliff edge. But now they were face to face with a scared adult lion, fully awake and fully powerful. His behavior could be unpredictable. As the other rangers backed away, Thomas looked the lion in the eyes, and it was almost like he understood that the man in front of him had just saved his life. There was a trust between them, so as the lion lay in the grass, breathing heavily from the shock and exhaustion, Thomas began to unfasten the ropes, not once fearing for his life. The other rangers looked on in shock at what he was doing. But it wouldn't be the last encounter between Thomas and the lion. And what happens next is not for the faint of heart. Saving the lion from the cliff was a moment that would stay with Thomas forever. Each day he headed out, though, he felt a continuous disappointment of never seeing the lion up close again. Since the incident, the big cat seemed to have become a little more reclusive, and in an area as vast as the national park, there was always somewhere to hide. Months passed, and soon the mood in the park took a shift as everyone started preparing for monsoon season. They desperately needed some rain, but monsoons came with their own problems, and flooding, destruction of habitats, and landslides were just some of the issues the rangers had to deal with while trying to protect the animals in the landscape. Of course, there was always the worry that the heavy rains would impact the rangers' homes too. So when the rainy season arrived, it was a time of high anxiety as they battled to preserve the park while not knowing what was happening to their own families. Thoughts of the lion rescue were at the back of everyone's minds. When the rain hit, it came thick and fast. Although it happened every year, it was never easy to deal with. Some years were worse than others, and in just a few days, Thomas could tell it would be a challenging few months battling the elements. The park had taken on a whole new look with the arrival of the rain. The watering holes were quickly filling up. The once dried grass was now lush and green, and new flowers were springing up. It always amazed Thomas that something so destructive could also make something so beautiful. He would soon know better than anyone just how dangerous the monsoon season could be. Navigating the park became more and more difficult with each day that more rain fell. The ground was becoming boggy, and the jeep struggled through the mud. The watering holes were now overflowing and flooding, and nests and dens for some of the animals that inhabited the park had been washed away. Thomas squinted through the rain as his wipers worked overtime on the jeep, never really wiping away the fat raindrops. He noticed what looked like a fallen tree in the distance, so he drove closer for a better look. Getting out of his jeep, he pulled his hood tight around his head as he inspected the tree. It was always worrying to see something like this. Just one tree of this size could be home to lots of animals, and now their habitat had been destroyed. Suddenly, Thomas was pulled from his thoughts by a rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath him. Glancing around for the source of the noise, he was shocked to see a wave of mud and other debris quickly heading his way. There had been a mudslide, and now it was too late to get back to the jeep. The young ranger felt panicked. He couldn't outrun the mudslide, and there was no high ground around that he could get to quickly enough. He climbed as high as he could on the fallen tree and held on tight. There was no way he could survive such a force of nature, but he had to at least try. As the mix of mud and water hit him, he felt like he was drowning. He gripped tighter onto the tree so as to not get carried away. As the flow of the thick mud slowed, Thomas felt relieved that there was still a small gap to breathe. If he wasn't found soon, though, his small gap would mean nothing. He focused on his breathing, knowing that panicking didn't help, but deep down, he knew everyone would be busy dealing with the mudslide. It would be a while before they noticed he was missing. Through the gap, he could see the rain was easing. The thick mud felt heavy on his limbs, and he couldn't move. Everything seemed so quiet now the rain was stopping, but then he noticed a shadow block out his small light source. He felt sure his mind was playing tricks on him, but he could have sworn he'd just seen a flash of sandy-colored fur. Thomas could feel a heavy sensation above him now and a movement through the mud. He prayed another mudslide wasn't coming, and he closed his eyes, trying to block out the negative thoughts. But as more time passed, the young man realized he could hear more sounds, almost as if the mud was being cleared away, and he was slowly gaining his freedom. The sound of panicked voices followed by a spine-tingling roar filtered into his mud prison, and he dared to hope that help had arrived. But would anyone know he was stuck? He imagined his jeep had been washed away, so how would anyone know where to look for him? He heard the roar again, and this time there was no mistaking it. There was a lion close by. Suddenly, someone called his name, and although he couldn't respond, he felt tears coming to his eyes. Someone was close by. There was hope after all. He'd spent all these years helping others, but now he was the one in need of saving. As more light began to filter in, Thomas looked up to see the welcome faces of some of the other rangers. They'd found him and were digging away the mud. He still wasn't sure they'd even known where to look, but he was just grateful to have survived the terrible experience. As he was pulled from the mud, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but when he saw a tired lion coated in mud with rainwater dripping from him, Thomas instantly knew that he was once again face to face with the lion he'd saved on a cliff. He stared in disbelief as he tried to piece all the pieces of the puzzle together. One of the rangers wrapped a blanket around him and led him to a nearby jeep. As he watched the lion disappear behind him, he couldn't find the words to ask the questions he wanted answers to. He was still in shock, but once he was cleaned up, the other rangers began to fill him in. At first, they insisted that Thomas should go to the hospital, but luckily, aside from a few surface-level cuts and bruises, he felt fine. He was just shaken by the incident. The other rangers told him they had heard the thundering sounds of the mudslide and had waited until it passed to head out and survey the damage. They'd split up into teams, but shortly after, they'd all received a radio call with the most odd message. One of the team had spotted a lion frantically digging through the mud and figured it was trying to rescue a member of its pride. It was only when they started to clear the mud that they realized it wasn't another lion that was trapped. It was Thomas. The ranger couldn't believe it. Never had he imagined that the lion he'd saved from the cliff would one day repay the favor. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that if they hadn't seen the lion trying to rescue Thomas, no one would have known where to look for him. The young ranger couldn't bear thinking about what would have happened to him. He owed his life to the lion, but would he ever see him again? As much as he didn't want to, Thomas was forced to take a week off work to rest and recover. By day 3, he was driving back to the national park in his uniform. He couldn't sit around at home when he felt fine and there was such a big cleanup operation to get on with. No sooner had he entered the national park than he spotted a familiar face. The lion was lying in wait under a tree, watching Thomas curiously. He stopped his car and wound the window down to properly look at the lion. All the mud that had coated its fur on the day of the rescue was gone, but it was definitely him. He watched Thomas drive along the road, then got up and stretched before walking away, as if he was satisfied that the ranger was okay. From then on, the lion who had needed saving from the cliff was no longer a recluse. Saving Thomas seemed to have brought back the confidence he lost in his own accident, and the ranger regularly saw him around the park, much to his delight. They'd saved each other's lives and would always have a bond that transcended species. Without each other, they probably wouldn't be around anymore, and they would be forever indebted to one another. Now it's over to you. How would you have felt in Thomas's position? Do you know of any other stories of animals and humans helping each other? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.